Last month, I sat down with former Navy Commander Steve Foster to discuss his father's incredible story as a prisoner of war escapee during World War II. Now, you can listen to the shortened interview clipped up on the Winchester Journalism YouTube channel, but here is the full interview with Steve. I hope you enjoy. Tell me about your relationship with your father, and did he really let anything on whilst he was still alive?
Not much about being a prisoner of war. Towards the end of his life, I talked to him about the hard time they had in Norway fighting the Germans, and he opened up to me on that. He was captured and wounded there, and very early in the war, before Dunkirk. But he didn't talk much about being a prisoner of war. Just little asides really about when he saw ridiculous films, he'd say it wasn't like that.
And so when you, obviously you wouldn't have known that at the time, but then later when you find out all of this stuff, you start putting those pieces together, I suppose.
Yeah, I did. And that the man he was a successful businessman, but he didn't really talk much about the war.
So how did you come to discover what we now know?
Well, I think it was the time of my life, 10 or 15 years ago, where I decided to look at the family tree. And my sister reminded me there was a dad's old suitcase in the loft. And I got it down really to look at his life. But I was sort of astounded to find all of these letters to military intelligence about an escape he and his friend had done during World War II from their prisoner of war camp in Poland. And it really, I stopped looking at the family tree and just read all of this stuff, which was quite incredible.
And what did you discover that surprised you most about that?
All of it, really. The fact that the escape had been 2 years in the preparation, and the fact that Anthony Coulthard, his good friend, was a German linguist and had taught Dad German for 3 hours every night. Dad had the sort of logistics of the job, and he did all the forging, producing false documents, bribing guards for passes, and it was done as a complete business really for 2 years, and I'm sure it's what kept them going and what kept them alive.
Yeah, you described it as a sort of unlikely relationship between them. We've been reading some of the letters from after the war, from Coulthard's mother. What did you come to learn about their relationship?
That they were good friends, and that's quite difficult to understand because Coulthard was a German linguist. He'd been to Oxford University, got a first, whereas Dad was the son of a bricklayer in the Midlands and had left school at 14. And so their backgrounds didn't immediately mesh, but obviously the urge to escape is what brought them together. For Dad, he'd been married 5 weeks, went to war, fought for 5 days, and then was a prisoner for 5 years. So I think, really, if you look at it, he wanted to get back to Mum. I think his was a personal thing. Whereas Anthony, I think, even though he was very keen on Germany and he'd studied there, I think he was just testing his ability. I think he was going to see if he could outwit the Germans and get out.
And of course he did try to do that several more times after the escape that your father was involved in.
He did. I've got evidence that from MI9 documents, MI9 were the military intelligence section for prisoners of war, that he escaped 8 or 9 times after Dad and he did the big escape. And so he was, in the end, seen as a troublemaker and a habitual escaper. The escape route started in their accommodation. It went into the Stalag headquarters where Dad worked, and then when the coast was clear, out of the back, through some German-only areas, and then into a stables where the clothes they had hidden there, they kept them in a bag, past the Sergeant Major's house, German Sergeant Major's, and into a second stable where they changed into their escape clothes, and 2 helpers took away their uniform. They jumped out of a top window and then past the German barracks and the German officer's house, and then turned left on the way to Torun to the station. They made it. This escape was very well planned, and they got on a train dressed as German businessmen and made it all the way through Germany, Poland and Germany, going through Berlin and Munich, and actually walking around Berlin intelligence gathering, which I find quite unbelievable. Eventually they got to the Swiss border at Lindau on Lake Constance, where Switzerland is only 2 miles away across the lake. The train came to a halt there and was going to go the long way around into Switzerland, and their plan was to sit on the train and do it. But the lure of the Swiss border, which is only 200 yards away, probably tempted them to break away from the plan, and they decided to walk into Switzerland. Coulthard, with his sort of dash and his daring and his good German, made it across. Dad, because of his demeanour or because of his lack of German language, was being severely interviewed by the Gestapo, and he looked up thinking, well, Coulthard's made it, I'm not going to make it. And he saw Anthony walking back from freedom into Germany to try and help Dad, and he walked up to the border guards and said, what's the problem? He's my colleague. We work for Siemens, Bau Union, which is a big engineering company. Here's our papers to say we have authority to go into Switzerland. What's the problem? And the guard said, could I just see your pass again, please? So he got it out. At that point, the guard pulled out his pistol, his Luger, and said, please, gentlemen, hands up, accompany me to the police station, where their passes were put under a microscope and were deemed false. And then 2 days of severe interrogation by the Gestapo, where they were beaten.
And so after that point they're separated?
Yeah, they were returned to Poland, but the only way they actually escaped with their lives there was that Dad persuaded Coulthard, who was still hanging on to the story that they were German, to admit they were British escaped POWs. Gestapo didn't believe them, but Dad persuaded the Gestapo to ring the prisoner of war camp in Poland, and the commandant there, the colonel, confirmed that Foster and Coulthard had escaped 2 days before. So put on the train back to Poland, 2 weeks in the cooler, as it was called, isolation ward, bread and water, and then shortly after that, Dad was moved to Bavaria, to a Bavarian prisoner of war camp for sergeants, and Coulthard, being a lance corporal, remained in Poland. The Soviets, the Russian front, they started to win the war, and they were advancing towards Poland. And Hitler decided that all Commonwealth, British, American POWs should march away from the 2 advancing fronts, one from France and one from Poland, into Bavaria to, I think it was going to be called the Eagle's Nest, where they were going to do their last stand. And historians believe, because there was 250,000 of them, that Hitler was going to use them as a bargaining chip to get an outcome of the war. So he wanted to keep them alive. So they were marched in front of the advancing Soviets. And it was in January 45, which was one of the worst winters on record, -20 temperature on average, and snow on the ground and ice. And the prisoners from Antony's hard working camp, there was 600 of them, 400 Russians, were given 24 hours notice to march. And they had to do 35, 40 kilometres every day. And they were in the sort of rags that they were captured in. And each evening they would rest either in the open or in a barn if they were lucky. And they all slowly started to die. But not through natural causes always. The captain in charge, a German captain, was a hard man, sadist, and he told the guards that if any of the British prisoners fell by the wayside, they had to be killed, clubbed, or shot, because he didn't want the Russians who were following to know the true story of what was happening to the prisoners. So all of the 400 Russians died in that way, because the Germans treated Russians as animals, really. But the British, only 30 died, and a very brave sergeant who was in charge of Anthony's column, kept a record of every death. Staff Sergeant Aitken, and he wrote an affidavit for the War Crimes Tribunal after the war, which was key evidence in Captain Mackensen being found guilty of murder. So Anthony was the last to die, and he died after having walked all the way through Poland, all the way through eastern Germany. He crossed the Elbe into western Germany, and he died in March of 45, the last to die. And he died of starvation, dysentery, and the Germans made him jump into the river Elbe, as they did all the prisoners. I can't think why. And he died of a heart attack shortly after that. And then his friends, the next morning, picked his body up, carried him to the nearest cemetery, and they buried him. So he was the last to die in that column. And the column was found by the British Army shortly after his death, and the 200 or 300 in that column were found and were saved.
Wow. And so your father comes home and he receives a letter, and this is when he discovers of Coulthard's passing.
Yeah, he didn't know. So this is a letter Dad received from Anthony's mother, Mrs. Coulthard, on May the 22nd, 1945, from their house in New Milton. And it reads, "Dear Sergeant Foster, I suppose you know my son Anthony Coulthard, or the Professor, from Stalag 20A, perished on the way home on one of those torture marches from Poland. Corporal Price, who lives in this district, with whom I got in touch, managed to get your address, hence this letter. I would particularly have liked to see you, as I believe you were the co-escapee with my son to the Swiss border in 1942, and from what I've heard, he made the fatal mistake of returning to help you at the last moment. Foolhardy, but praiseworthy, and now he has gone, perished miserably and unnecessarily. What I would really like to know are a few details about that escape." And the records show they wrote to each other, but Anthony died shortly before Dad got home. Dad, from the camp in Bavaria, did a short march, but it wasn't in the horrific conditions that they did from Poland, and they all were found by the American army, and he was sent home to UK, and waiting for him at his house was a letter from Mrs. Coulthard explaining Anthony's death, and she wanted to know the details of the big escape they did. And so a series of letters went between Mrs. Coulthard and Dad in March and April and May of 45, with Dad explaining exactly how the escape went and how brave Anthony was.
And after discovering all of this yourself, you decide to take this amazing journey, retracing almost your father's steps and learning Coulthard's story as well, and providing some closure there. What made you want to take that journey?
Well, I'd gained respect for both men. I'd always respected Dad, but I hadn't realised what a good soldier he was. And so I thought, I'd recently retired, I'm a keen motorcyclist, give me something to do. So for a year I motorbiked over to Norway and found out where his regiment fought, where he was captured. And then I turned my attention to him being a POW. And it was at that point I found out this amazing detail about the escape. So I decided I would try and find Anthony's grave. I discovered that his grave had never been found, and I felt that I owed that to the Coulthard family. Really, as payback, I suppose, because Anthony had given up his freedom and eventually his life for Dad. And I felt that if I found his grave, it was something I could do for them. And so that was the driving factor, really.
You're able to recall your father's story with this immense detail, and that's all down to the way your father recorded everything. He was a clerk, if I'm correct.
He was, yeah, he was a solicitor's clerk. very good typist and knew shorthand very well. He was a reporter. So he managed to record everything after the war for Mrs. Coulthard, writing lengthy letters. And he also wrote to military intelligence explaining the story of the escape, because he felt Anthony should be awarded a medal for what he did. And it was because of that letter to MI9 that Anthony was awarded a posthumous mention in dispatches, which is the highest level of bravery award that was available at the time. So yeah, and I found it all in an old suitcase in the loft. Pages and pages of it. Found his medals there. And it was quite an eye-opener, really.
Why do you think he kept all of those letters? Because he never really let on the extent of it. Do you think he thought you would find them one day?
I don't know. He may have had survivor's guilt, I don't know. But he never acted as if he had survivor's guilt. He used to go off to his annual get-togethers with his POW chums and come back with a sore head every year. So I'm sure that externally he didn't show any signs of that. But I think he lived with the fact that Anthony came back for him.
How did you feel discovering all of that?
Sorrow that Anthony died in the way he did, after having been so brave in coming back from Switzerland into Germany to help Dad. And also, to say neither of them were professional soldiers. One was a student and one was a clerk. They both joined for hostilities only. What a brave thing they did. So I guess my thoughts about Dad changed, about what a good soldier he was.
And being able to go on that journey with your sister as well must have really strengthened that relationship between the two of you.
It did, and we were so lucky. We were brought up in Grantham, in the Midlands, with a loving family. And she went on to be a doctor. I went on to become, join the Royal Navy. So Dad had high aspirations for us both. And I think that was because of his working class background.
So many years later, you get an offer to turn your father's story into a book.
Yes.
How does that come about?
Dan Snow was the key to it, really, the historian. A friend of mine went to one of his lectures and gave Dan my information, my contact details, and said, if you want another story, there's a good one. And Dan contacted me by email, which I duly ignored, but his PA told me to contact Dan. He came to the house here, and I told him the whole story from beginning to end. And he was very easy to answer. He was a very good interviewer. And so he turned that into a podcast. Mirror Books executive heard it. They got hold of me and they asked me to write a book because they thought the story was so outstanding.
And did writing the book give you a sense of viewing the story through a different lens? Did it offer a new perspective?
Yeah, I think we had to find a lot of words, and it was trying to expand the story to those words, which was difficult, but it was a good exercise actually. And me and Alan Clark, the ghostwriter who was allocated to me, a lovely man, we went through every document we had, and between us, he used to come here and interview me just as you're doing, and then we got words on paper, and by email with attachments we slowly built up the story. And a very good writer, Alan, and he decided that I wasn't a very good storyteller, so he added his skill to it, and we got it into a book.
I suppose it must have been nice after so many years of trying to pull together information from all these different places to then be able to create that linear narrative. I suppose that would have made a clearer picture in your mind as well of what the actual story was.
It did, and without the book I probably wouldn't have gone into that detail. And I occasionally reread the book just to remind myself of the story.
It's an unbelievable story. we were saying earlier, it would have made a great movie. Have you ever had any thoughts about a movie or any people getting in contact saying we'd like to create something out of this?
It became a possibility shortly after the book was published. I was contacted by the BBC, I think, and one or two freelance people to say, I can convert this into a film script if you wish. And then COVID came along and it all died, and it never really reappeared. Mirror Books were very keen that it became a film.
Were you keen on it becoming a film?
I would have been. I wouldn't have wanted it to become like most of the war films where America won the war. And it would have needed to have been very accurate, and I would have made sure it was. Their age, at the age of their escape, 27 and 24, it would have needed two young actors. And so I was sort of thinking about how that would be made. But it came to nothing. But the book sold reasonably well. It sold quite a lot of copies. So I was very pleased that the story had got out.